I'm not late, am I? Oh no, the door opened! I'm not late, am I? I'm on time? Do you have the time? What time is it? And what is time? No, but really, work time. It's the most important thing when it comes to working with resin. Your work time or pot life is going to determine just about everything when it comes to how stringy a Petri is going to be versus how defined and sharp your edges between two different colors are. And the best way we can utilize that work time to get the effect we're going for in our resin dice and other artwork. Let's get started. You might be asking yourself, what exactly is pot life or work time? Essentially what it is the manufacturer's recommendation from when you mix your part A and your part B together that you have that long to work with the resin before you should set it down and walk away. Now, usually this is because that's the point when the manufacturer has noted that you're going to have either less air escaping, so the bubbles you've introduced rising to the surface so that they can degas, or the point when it should no longer be stirred or mixed with because it may cause what's known as flash curing. Now, flash curing sucks. Flash curing is when you have a runaway chain reaction from the exothermic heat that's generated by the resin. Remember, with the resins, almost all of them operate on exothermic reactions. And the more heat that is in the system, it creates a chain and just builds up more and more heat, which then cures the resin quicker and quicker. So if you haven't disturbed your resin in a while and you go to stir it, you are causing a point where the resin can start to harden. It's very similar to the same chain reaction that happens when water is cooled below its freezing point, but it doesn't freeze. But then as soon as you flick it or an impurity is introduced, it chain reactions and immediately all freezes. That is the exact same system that's happening with flash curing. It's a runaway cascade that causes the resin to cure almost instantly as soon as it's disturbed. So if that's the danger of work time, why would you want to push to work time or even beyond it? Well, the other thing that comes with the later stage of work time, as it's curing, from the point you mix the A and the B, it's going to start getting thicker and thicker. And that increased viscosity is going to help with your color separation. So if you're going for a really defined, crisp, say, red and blue color separation on your die, the best way to do that is by pushing your work time out as far as possible to the point before you mix those two together in the die. So it's a really fine balance you have to find between tiptoeing on the work time and not going so far as where you have a flash cure, or even worse, it's so thick and syrupy that you can't properly degas or cure the dice under pressure to remove those bubbles. The best way to go about this is by doing a resin timing test, because on the other side of the spectrum, if you're wanting those really nice color blends or that really pretty Petri effect where you get lots of ink plumes coming down and through the die, then you're going to need to know when that timing is right, because wait too long and your ink's not going to plume, it's just going to sit on the surface of the resin because it's too thick. Do it too early and your ink is going to plume all the way down and you're going to end up with a die that just is colored and has a little bit of strings and not that really pretty distinct Petri pluming that you see in a lot of the high-end custom dice out there. So the best way that you can do this is by getting yourself a candy mold. This is the candy mold that I like to use. I'll have it linked below. It comes with two, which is great if you're doing multiple types of tests. Say you want to do your Petri test at the same time as your multicolor test. In today's video, we're just going to be focusing on the Petri method and testing that, but these same techniques apply to all types of resin testing. The important thing with your mold is that they are consistently the same thickness. So you don't want a mold, say you're testing this, but at the same time you're testing this, because they're going to be completely different. Remember, the more resin in the container, the quicker that heat builds up because it's a self-feeding system. Because you can use your regular dice mold and run the test multiple times over the course of a week or two. But in order to get it done quickly and concisely, I always recommend going with a nice cheap candy mold like this. I'll have it linked down below, that way you can follow along with the exact same process that I'm doing. The reason I like this one is it's got a clear breakdown of a 1 hour mark. The other benefit that it has is it has multiple sections for each of our hour marks. So we're going 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60. So that gives us a 6x4 grid. Despite your best efforts, resin is never gonna do the exact same thing twice. It is a very complex chemical reaction, and even the smallest change in variables can change how that comes out. So having 4 different spots where you've done it at the same time is the best way where you can see a little bit of variation between every single minute mark. Now the resin I'm going to be working with today is called Liquidy Split. It's from KS Resin. I like it because it is a very fast work time resin. So the benefit of that is its cure time is about 4 to 6 hours where you can actually demold. Now the drawback to that is you only have about 15 minutes of work time before it starts to get really thick. So rather than doing a 60-minute breakdown with this mold, I'm going to be doing it in 2.5-minute increments. So we go from 2.5 minutes all the way up to the full 15-minute work time. I have used KS resin all the way up to 30 minutes if I'm going for a very distinct separation. And that's where testing comes into play. You need to be familiar with your resin. Taking the time to do these resin tests is the best way to do that. I'm going to demold these so we can take a closer look and see how that alcohol ink penetrated through the resin, through the various work times. And make sure when you're doing this that you either have a template ready to go. I recommend doing a piece of paper with the sections numbered out, or if you're not worried about the backside of your molds, taking a Sharpie directly to the top of each one. In this instance, I'm going to go ahead and leave them as is so we can take a close look at both the front and back, but I'm going to notate it on my notebook here. Each one of our testers has now been fully demolded, and we can take a look at the beautiful Petri effect that we got between each of our work times. Okay, so I've got our work time demold tester resins set up in the order they were poured. So we've got our 2.5 minute, 5 minute, 7.5, 10 minute, 12.5, and 15-minute work time pourers. Now with this particular resin, I delayed an initial 2.5 minutes just because the effect for the first couple minutes, I personally have noticed, doesn't make that much of a difference. So I wanted to make sure to be able to get the full work time. If you haven't worked with the resin before, you definitely want to do that. Now you can see already right off the bat there's some subtle differences between each of our 4 different ones that we did for every work time, and that's exactly why we do that. So that way when we're working with our testers, we can see the different variations. So on each of our samples here with our initial 2.5 minute, you can see we got quite a bit of inking that sank. And that was because the resin being less viscous, the ink was able to sink through it a little bit more clearly, creating this really pretty wispy effect. Now with this particular resin, you can see that the buildup was mostly on the sides as it clung to the edge and went down. You'll get that same effect in your dice as well, so be mindful of it. So you can see we've got the most highlighted effect of the alcohol ink drip effect on this sample. Now, every single one of these has a very extreme form of the ink sink, which is what we were looking for since this was the earliest point of our resin testers. But they're not all the same, and that simply comes down to that variation effect. So remember, when you're doing your testing molds, you want to make sure you've got multiples of each, because otherwise you can run into the issue where you think you're going to get one effect when in reality that was an outlier. Now simply moving forward from our 2.5 minute to our 5 minute, you can already see there's a drastic difference in this resin and the amount of sinkage. There is still a lot of Petri along the edges, but it's not nearly as pronounced as our initial example. We're still getting some stringing, but you can also see in this sample all of these, the red, whoop, you see the red was the most dominant. And all of these, I did red, then blue in the pour because I wanted to keep it consistent. Now, what's really interesting with this is the reason that it was dominant is the work time had gotten to the point where the ink couldn't quite sink. So as soon as the red hit the top of our resin, rather than sinking immediately, it started to go across the resin surface. And then when we added our ink sinking, the Blanco Blanco white, then it was started to pull down. So you can see at a lot of these, we still have some nice blue, but the red is dominant since it was the first color. And this is something I wouldn't have expected unless I've done these tests. And you can see that reflected on the back side as well, where we did our initial inking. Now we're at the 7.5 minute of our work time. So we're at the halfway point of the work time on this resin. You can see we're still getting a little bit of the Petri effect, but what we're getting is our cells are now starting to be pulled apart. So you can see that most effectively in this sample here, and the light goes right through it. There's actually, on every single one of these samples, rather than there being a concentrated ink, there's now more diffusion, because as the alcohol ink wasn't able to sink all the way, it actually started to evaporate up and off. And whenever it evaporated away, it just left the ink behind, creating little pockets or cells. So you get this really cool effect where it's almost like a webbing or mesh effect. And on the back side, you can see that effect is also very pronounced. Now, on one of these samples, we had an accidental drip of white where there wasn't any color. And you can see that that white did sink quite a bit more. And that's just the nature of using the Blanco Blanco. The whole point of it is that it's a heavy, dense pigment and it will sink in your resin. And without the additional inking being pulled down with it, it sunk all on its own. So we've still got the Petri effect. All of these have a little bit of Petri effect going on. We still have some of those wisps, still have some of the depth going in, but we're really staying now extremely focused and concentrated just to that top surface and getting more of a mushroom spore effect rather than those deep wisps that you see most commonly associated with the Petri effect. All right, now here we go. We're moving on. We are at the 10-minute mark. So we are past our halfway mark on our resin, and now you can really see the color separation has started to got really heavy. So we're not getting any muddling of color beyond right where the edge is. You've got very defined red side and blue side, but the red is still dominant because it was poured initially, so it had more time to creep across to the other side of the resin. So that's, again, something to keep in mind. Now you can see here, rather than getting a super pronounced Petri effect throughout, you're just getting little spots of heavier Petri effect where the white, when it was applied, didn't mix completely with the colored alcohol ink and started to sink on its own. So you're actually getting little pockets of the Petri effect where it is pulling down and going throughout the mold with the colored inks being left behind. Very cool effect. And now we're almost done here. We are at the 12.5 minute mark, and this is where you can really see like extreme color separation has started. So you can see it's very distinct in this piece here. You've got parts where there's not even color to the resin on all of these. There are voids where the ink just sat on top of the resin and didn't even have time to diffuse across it because the resin had gotten to a more syrupy thickness. So rather than the alcohol ink just straight sitting on top of it, it actually caused it to divot down a little bit because of the weight and prevented it from spreading as evenly. So you have very distinct 50-50 red and blues with a little bit of that Petri effect, but now it's more of a flat color with a little bit of a bumpy surface, much less plumes. And you can see that is very easily reflected in the back sides where you have that clear resin popping through. And last but not least is our 15-minute work time. This is very similar to the 10-minute work, or excuse me, the 12.5-minute work time we just looked at. The main difference being it is even more pronounced, where you can see there is a clear dividing line between the red and the blue, and the Petri effect is only existing on the very fringes, on the edges, where the white was able to collect and pool down in the little dips and divots made in the resin surface from the weight of the ink. There's no Petri effect throughout the entire mold. All you can see is these very heavy pockets where you're getting extreme coloration of just either the blue or the red. Today we focus mainly on testing your resin work time for Petri, and you can see there's a very drastic effect between the start of the work time and the end of the work time, even on a resin that cures as quickly as the liquidy split. Just having a few minutes of difference really affected how much depth and penetration we got with our alcohol inks, and really changed the way the red and the blue meddle together to create a different color. Keep that in mind whenever you're testing, that this works with all styles of resin pour. I usually recommend doing a Petri test, a dual color test, and then a 4 or 5 color test so you can really see the effects that you get between your different work times. Also remember, you really want to stick with contrasting colors when you're doing this. So in our example, we did red and blue because they give a very clear distinction of the red side, blue side, and purple where they mix and mingled. So our next upcoming video in the series is going to be how to avoid getting the tacky edge on your Petri style dice. We got really nice plumes and a really good definition of our work time throughout these tests. So now it's time to move on to that next step and apply our tests to the real world and make some beautiful dice. Hope you all having a great day and happy dice making.